Good morning. Glad to be with each of you this morning. Wes and Holly are at Camp Blue Haven this week. There's also some McDermott campers there as well, so they're teaching a class there. I know those students will be blessed by having Wes teaching them this week. We also have a group of 3rd through 6th graders of 55 students leaving today to go to Camp Canaan, and then that'll kind of just start a series of multiple weeks of our kids going out and learning and serving. And so I'd like to offer a prayer on their behalf as we begin. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the many wonderful blessings that you've given us. We ask you to be with the students going to church camp today, and that you'll help them to grow closer to you and to each other. We ask that they hear the words that they need to hear to prick their hearts so that they will come to love your Son more fully. It's your name that we pray. Amen. I always like to give 2 reminders when I preach. I don't preach very often, and the first reminder is the good news is Wes will be back next week. That's always number 1. Number 2 is if there's anything I say that bothers you or offends you, you can always email me at kyle@ccmcdermott.org. So those are my 2 reminders as we get started this morning. But we're going to continue in our Loving Loyalty series. We have been looking at how, as a church, we can, like God has for us, develop an unshakable commitment in response to this unmerited favor. He has given us so much love, so much grace. He has this unshakable commitment to us. How do we, in turn, grow in our faith, grow in our allegiance, grow in our commitment to Him? And so the last time that we were in this series, this was the takeaway that Wes provided for us. It's loyalty to Jesus is how you live when no one else is looking. And that's so true, isn't it? We all have to face that reality that sometimes our discipleship is most tested in those normal moments of everyday life, those normal moments of being at home or being at work or being on the freeway, right? Those are the times in which our discipleship is often tested. And so I would like to kind of build off of that takeaway this morning to talk about habits, to talk about spiritual formation and how we grow in our habits. And I understand there's some maybe some trepidation around the word habit, because sometimes maybe it's presented as being this rote thing or being something that is not intentional. But I think if you really think about what our habits are, they're incredibly intentional, right? They just didn't come out of nowhere. They were developed, and we have some good habits and we have some bad habits, and thinking about how we develop those habits is very important. Justin Whitmill Early defines a habit. It's a behavior that occurs automatically over and over and often unconsciously, right? We develop these rhythms, these patterns that then become the way we go about daily life. And yesterday I was kind of reminded of one of these, and it's one that I think we can relate to. I was taking the counselors out to Camp Canaan yesterday, and we left just right when the rain just started coming down. And so 35 was just a nightmare, and there was a wreck, and I was pulling the trailer, and at that moment I was very, very intentional about my driving, right? I was very intentional to be alert. I had a van full of people that I was responsible for, and so I was very locked into my driving at that moment, right? But so many days when I drive home, I just get home, right? I don't think about how I got there, right? I'm listening to sports radio, or I'm thinking about what happened that day, and an important action, as important as driving, right? An important responsibility, I just do. And we all just do these things because we've developed habits. Charles Duhigg, in his research on habits, suggests as high as 40% of the actions people perform in a day weren't actually decisions, but habits. And whether that number is right, I don't know. But the idea that almost half of what we do comes as a result of the patterns we've developed, I think it really makes us think about those patterns. So how mindful are we about these patterns that we're forming? And so the takeaway I want to put forward today is loyalty to Jesus forms grace-shaped habits or rhythms, right? It shouldn't be just something that we develop by our own sheer willpower. Like we know that when we try to develop habits just by gritting our teeth and bearing it, whether it's a new fitness plan or it's a new self-improvement, whatever. Doesn't always work, right? I know I've got plenty of plans that I've started that ended very, very quickly, right? And so there's got to be something deeper in this habit development, in this character shaping. And so the text that we're going to look at this morning, if I'm being perfectly honest, is a text that really scared me as a kid, a text that I remember being preached at our church and coming home to my parents and being like, what if I miss Jesus, right? What if he's right there around me? Or what if he's right there in my path and I just miss him and I don't serve him? And that was the way that I interpreted this text. And I remember it being like a great point of anxiety. And I've even brought that, kind of into adulthood when I approached this text of instead of it being like a hopeful thing, it just is a very sobering thing about how we go about our lives. And I think there's obviously supposed to be a sobering element. There's supposed to be a shock factor to it. It's a very strong text, but I'd like to suggest this morning that it's actually meant as a hopeful message to his disciples at a time that is very difficult for them and kind of even points to some difficult times that may come in their lives in the future. So let's start there in verse 37 of our text, because this is what made me first think, okay, maybe it has to do with habits or rhythms. I remember thinking about this text and maybe just thinking too much about the takeaway of wanting to see other people as Jesus, that maybe I didn't critically notice the fact that the questions asked by the righteous and the unrighteous are exactly the same, right? They respond the same way to this proposition that Jesus gives them about him being there with the poor, the needy, the sick, etc. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison or go to visit you? Right? And I guess because I always got so locked in on the takeaway that maybe I missed the fact that, they weren't doing this with that in mind originally. Right? It's like Jesus amplifies their understanding of what they had done, right? That he adds that layer of, it's like you did it for me, but he's commending the fact that they were already doing this, right? He's commending the fact that this was something that was a part of their lives. This was a rhythm. This maybe could even be suggested a habit, that when they came into situations where help was needed, where love was needed to be extended to those in need, they did it, right? They lived that way. And so I think understanding this, it helps us to look a little bit more at the context of this passage. And Wes does a really good job of reminding us to always look at the context. And he always says, hey, even if it's possible to read the whole book, go ahead and read the whole book. And that's so true, right? It's really important. And in this passage, if you could read all of Matthew, you'd pick up on some of the themes that are there. But one kind of helpful tool for me is when I don't have time to maybe read the whole book, is to pull up an outline. And there's a lot of outlines for different books, but most of the time, they're pretty close to the same. And the outline for Matthew is typically either in 4 sections or kind of 5 discourses, right? And so if I don't have time to read the whole book, at least I'm going to read the whole section that the passage is in. And so this passage comes in section 4 of Matthew, and it's in the section in which the Messiah, Jesus, has entered Jerusalem, right? It starts with the triumphal entry, and he's literally rendering judgment on the people of Israel, and in more particular, the religious leaders of Israel, right? He goes to the temple, he turns over the tables, he teaches them how they are misusing what was meant to be a house of prayer, right? That was meant to be a place of connection to God. It's not that in the way that they're living right now. He also, teaches in these parables about how they've missed him, right? About how he is the king. He has come into the city, and just like the prophets of old, they didn't recognize him, right? And then he's got this section of woes, right? If you want to, really see Jesus, just let it go, right? Read that section in 23. And he just really goes after the people for how they're living. And then, on top of that, when he's walking with the disciples, he says, hey, the temple, right, it's even going to be gone, right? Everything you've kind of known up to this point, everything that you think is kind of the pinnacle of your relationship with God and how you connect with him, it's not going to be there anymore. And this has kind of got them a little bit stressed, right? So what makes them begin this conversation in the first place? If you'll go to the next slide. What starts this conversation is actually in Matthew 24, verse 3. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, and they said, "What will happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Right? And there's just kind of a level of nervousness. And then if you read 24, Jesus begins talking about things from Daniel and different prophecies and images. And then we come to 25, and he tells two parables, right? He tells the parable of the 10 virgins, and he tells the parable of the talents. And then he leads into this. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep and the goats. And so the people have been challenging his authority throughout his entire time in Jerusalem, and he's making it abundantly clear that the Son of Man has some authority, right? That all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people, right? And so they are in his hands like we all are in his hands. And so it says he will put, verse 33, he will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world." And so this, what might seem like a reaction to Israel's unfaithfulness, that's not the case, right? Jesus' coming is not plan B, right? All of this has been leading up to Jesus. And in fact, this preparation of the kingdom has been happening since the creation of the world. And then he says, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." And this is not a new message in the sense that throughout the Bible there are themes about helping people in these types of positions, right? Just the fact that it's now Jesus saying these things that is amplifying it to the next level. But the law and the prophets that the Israelites were supposed to be familiar with spoke of these themes. And in fact, in chapter 22 and leading up to this, that kind of been happening on questioning his authority, the experts in the law ask him just this, right? What's the most important thing? What's the most important thing that we're supposed to do? In Matthew 22, he answers. They said, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments," right? The call to treat people well in a loving way was not new, right? In fact, it is saturated in the Torah about ways that we should treat people. And the people there, they are, still, maybe responding to this idea that it's Jesus, right? That part might be new, right? In verse 37, like we looked at earlier, it says, "When did we see you?" Right? They're still grappling with that. But the people who would have heard Jesus' original response, they would have recognized where it was coming from, right? They would have recognized the fact that he was drawing from Deuteronomy and he was drawing from Leviticus. And so if we go back to Deuteronomy, we see the connection between these commandments and the rhythms and the habits that they're supposed to instill, or how those rhythms and habits are supposed to instill this perspective in us. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on your door frames of your houses and on your gates," right? It sounds a lot like habit formation to me, right? Make this a part of your daily life. Put this in each thing that we might consider even mundane, right? Be talking about these things. Be growing in love for God. And later on in that same passage, in verse 20, he talks about when they're asked about why they're doing this. It says, in the future, when your son asks you, what is the meaning of these stipulations, of these decrees and laws that the Lord our God has commanded you? It says, tell him we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, right? It's grace. It's grace that's the start of this lifestyle, right? What a gracious act when God takes this people who, one, didn't deserve him in the first place, right? He chose them not because of how big they were as a nation or anything special about them, but yet he brings them out of their suffering. He brings them out of captivity in Egypt. And so it's grace is why we're doing these things. It's grace is why we're creating these habits. And if you read through Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, like look for those references to being brought out of Egypt, right? They're there. They're there a lot because he wants them to remember as he's teaching them about these patterns of life, about how they're supposed to relate to each other, that it all starts with the fact that I got you when you were at your worst place, at your lowest place, and I brought you out of there by my mighty hand. And so it's in God's grace that prompts these rhythms and the formation of these habits. 25 verse 40 says, the king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And if you were to dig into this passage, you would see that this is actually probably where most of the debate or conversation is, and it's around the phrase brothers and sisters of mine, right? Some people think that this is a text that is preparing the disciples for what they're going to face as they go out, right, as his people in the future, and that the nations are going to be judged on how they treat them, right? And I don't think that's an unfair reading of the text, right? God is concerned about the people that go out in his name. He is concerned about their welfare. He does provide for us when we're at our low points, right? So I think that's a fair reading of the text, but sometimes there are certain folks that want to say that's the only thing of the text, and I don't think that's quite it, right? I think it's both an encouragement that God is going to take care of you as one of his disciples, but it's also a reminder of something that he's been telling them over and over throughout his ministry, and even throughout Scripture, we see that we're supposed to treat people in a loving way. So I think it can be a both and here. And so, when they're thinking about what they did for the least of these, when they think about what they're doing for those in need, this should also bring encouragement because of what has come in 24. In 24, starting in verse 36, it says, but about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day of Noah entering the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be in the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in a field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a hand mill, and one will be taken and the other left. And so what's he telling them? Well, this is in a series of teachings, and those 2 parables, the parables of the 10 virgins and the talents, is included in that series of teachings. But he's telling them that until I come back, you're not going to know the exact time, but I've given you a responsibility, right? I've given you a way to express your faithfulness, to express your allegiance. For Noah, that was building the ark, right? He didn't know exactly when the flood was going to come. There were all these other people around him that were behaving in a way that didn't acknowledge the reality that was coming, but he had a task, and for him it was building the ark. For us, I would like to suggest he's saying it's loving others, right? He's saying you may not know exactly when I come back. You may not be able to know the signs of the end of the age, but what you're supposed to do in the meantime is treat people in need like you would treat me, right? And so that's supposed to be hopeful because they're really nervous about having to know the time. And he's saying, don't worry about that. He's saying, in the time that is now, love people, right? Live in these rhythms. At the core of extending love to others is remembering that grace that we've received, right? Live in response to that grace in the way that you treat others. And so here gets to the sobering part, right? In verse 41, then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you are accursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels, right? This is sobering. And I think if you were to read Jesus's critique of the Pharisees and the leaders of the law that precedes this, and even in the midst of those woes that are so striking, you still see a compassion. Right? You still see a compassion for Jerusalem. He wants them to know him. Right? He wants them to be restored. He wants that relationship with God to be as it was intended to be. And in the same way, we should want that for those of all the nations who don't know him. Right? This passage should hopefully help us grow in our compassion and not necessarily in our fear. But we want everyone to know Jesus. And they answer, "For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." Right? And they will answer, "Lord," and we see the same pattern. We didn't see you hungry, thirsty, stranger, and eating clothes, sick in prison, and not help you. Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. And so it seems like their habits, rhythms, lifestyles that they were living weren't producing a loving response to others. And in Matthew 23, before the woes, he too is critiquing the habits of the leaders. Matthew 23, verses 1 through 3. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy and cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and their tassels on their garments long," and it just keeps going about their desire to be seen. But it even references those things that they were supposed to do as reminders, right? They've got the phylacteries, right? They've got the reminder tools. They've got what's supposed to produce the habits, and they're even saying the right things, right? He's saying, listen to them, but they're not living it, right? They're not doing what he desires for them to do. And so there's a popular book about habits a couple years ago called Atomic Habits, and it's a really interesting book. And in it, the author talks about the connection between habits and identity, right? There's so many things that before we can even begin to address our lifestyles, our rhythms, we got to address our understanding of who we are. And this is a secular statement. It wasn't originally intended to have religious implication, but I think it does. It says, "The more deeply a thought or action is tied to your identity, the more difficult it is to change it. It can feel comfortable to believe what your culture believes, a group identity, or what it upholds, your self-image or personal identity, even when it's wrong. The biggest barrier to positive change at any level, individual, team, or society, is identity conflict. Good habits make rational sense, but if they conflict with your identity, you will fail to put them into action." Right? Isn't that true? That's what happens, right? Sometimes we just go back to what we want other people to see. And that's what's happening here, right? They're more concerned with that than what is supposed to be happening with the words that they're supposed to be living by. And so ultimately, at the end of that, before he starts the woes, in verse 11, he says, "The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humble, and those who humble themselves will be exalted," right? Those patterns, those rhythms, those grace-formed patterns and rhythms are supposed to shape us, and they're supposed to shape our character and disposition into the world. And so ultimately, in verse 25, 46, it ends with, "Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life." And so is this whole thing a works righteousness passage? Absolutely not, right? This is Jesus teaching how his disciples to live in love, right? To live in light of the grace of God. Scott read the crucifixion account in Matthew, right? That's part of what this passage is. It's part of the Passion Week, right? He's teaching his disciples certain things before he goes to the cross, right? The ultimate sign of grace. The kids at Canaan are studying Ephesians 2, 8 through 10 this week, and it really captures what this kind of text represents. For it is by grace that you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it's a gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. For we are God's handiwork, created in Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do, right? And so ultimately, at the end of the day, grace is opposed to earning, but it's not opposed to effort, right? We can't earn God's grace. It's this unmerited favor, but we can respond in a way that shows that we understand the grace that he's given us. And we're going to mess up, right? There are going to be times in which we don't treat others the right way. There are going to be times that we don't live out the things that we want to do. That's one of the things that still gives me so much pause about teaching and preaching, because I know there are people in here that have seen me at times not live this way, right? That have seen me not treat other people the way that I want to be treated. I know there's people in my life that would point that out, but that's where the grace comes in, right? That's where the grace is for us. I saw a story probably about, 6-7 months ago. It was floating around Facebook, and every once in a while I'll see a story, and I'll just kind of mentally tuck it away, and it's like, okay, that'll preach, right? And I circled it, and it said that there was a desk at the airport in Salzburg for people who thought they were flying to Australia, but had ended up in Austria, right? And I saw that, and I was like, that's relatable, right? I could do that. That could be, not paying attention, not doing things that I'm supposed to do, and here I'm stuck. Well, it turns out, as I was researching this week, it's a fake story, okay? It's not true. It actually stemmed from this ad that was on a carousel in the airport that was, basically a joke about, hey, sorry, it's Austria, not Australia, right? But it made for a good story. Because even with our best intentions, sometimes we end up at a destination or a place in life that we didn't intend when we started out, right? And there's good news for us that Jesus' grace is there for us, even when our habits, our rhythms, our patterns are out of sync with where we want them to be. And so this morning, if you need prayers, if you need us to rally around you and re-encourage you in your walk, if you need encouragement to feel the love of your brothers and sisters, if you are wanting to put Jesus on in baptism, now's a great day and a great time to do that. So if there's anything that we can do for you, come now as we stand and as we sing.